If Britain was a garden, Christianity has been the gardener for 2,000 years in many ways.
The Christian idea transforms the Greek, the Hellenist idea, and gives it a purpose and a direction.
It's baked into the very fabric of all of our institutions, our law, our constitutional monarchy.
If we want to keep Western culture alive, biblical literacy is fundamental, because it is partly what made Western culture.
Lest we forget, women in the West took way too long to get there, but to poo-poo the West and say the only thing about it is that people are still under the shackles of racism is to poo-poo the incredible, necessary and right gains that women have made that are so contrary to almost most other countries in the world.
Christianity, which at least as it used to be taught, and the way it's taught now is changing unfortunately, used to be based on the idea that you are actually a sinful person and that you should strive to be better. Whereas the current orthodox, I would say, in British schools at least, is you are a marvellous person and you should be outraged by everything that's wrong with other people. That is a big change, and a regrettable change in my view.
The West is under attack. We live in the freest, healthiest and wealthiest societies in human history. Yet as authoritarian and oppressive regimes threaten us from without, a new movement within tells us to feel nothing but shame for who we are.
The thing that I'm quite frustrated about, as I think you can probably tell, is we in the West are doing it to ourselves. Instead of saying, no, the West is great. The West is great because we have these values that we're not embarrassed about. We're not embarrassed about the fact that we think human beings should be treated as individuals. We're not embarrassed about the idea that through a lot of hard work, through a lot of pain, through a lot of suffering, the MLK idea that people should be treated on the content of their character was starting to take root in our society. And we're not going to overturn it because a few radical activists want to defund the police or defund the family or whatever it is that they want to do. This is what we believe in.
Welcome to the West. This is my take on the great and still unfolding adventure of who we are and why it matters. This is a history of how our extraordinary, unconventional civilization came to be and why it must be defended. It's a fascinating and often unexpected journey, stretching back 15 centuries to the fall of Rome. The first Westerners were barbarians, brave warriors with a primitive but heroic culture, who in the ruins of the Roman Empire began to build something extraordinary. And out of that rough soil grew something astonishing. A whole new post-Roman culture emerged. Now our epic journey continues, because the barbarian West would have been nothing without the faith that transformed it.
Christianity is core to who we are as a civilization.
I would broaden the lens just a little bit and say biblical religion is absolutely crucial to the civilization of the West. Christianity owes a great debt to its parent religion, Judaism. The exodus of Israel from Egypt, I think, remains the foundational historical metaphor for the meaning of true freedom in the Western civilizational project. What Christianity added to the mix was a kind of democratization of holiness, democratization of human possibility.
The God that's revealed in Christianity is really a God that embodies reason itself, and that divine reason has been imprinted upon our minds. These things are unique to us as human beings, and that is the synthesis of faith and reason that I think is very much characteristic of the West. And we know this also because when that synthesis starts to break down, or if it gets torn apart, then we start to see significant social, political, and economic dysfunctionality erupt in wherever that synthesis starts to break down. And I do worry that that's exactly what we're finding happening today.
Many of the things which we think are examples of Western liberalism, they are in effect, it's called sometimes spilt Christianity. And it's perfectly true that the Enlightenment began in France as a rebellion against the church and an attempt to destroy it. But when the attempt to destroy it was made, it just revealed all kinds of things that can't be delivered by a purely secular society. Best summed up, I think, by Talleyrand when he was asked, well, how can we establish the religion of humanity? He said, well, nothing simpler. Get yourself crucified and rise again on the third day.
Christianity brings moral revolution wherever it arrives. When St. Paul first brought its teachings from the Middle East to Europe in 51 AD, the locals in Thessalonica rioted. They cried out, "These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also." They were right. Christianity's message was shocking. Love your neighbour, not just your tribe. The idea that everyone was equal in the sight of God transformed the West's culture and produced extraordinary buildings like this, Canterbury Cathedral, completed in 1126. William of Malmesbury wrote of it, "Nothing like it could be seen in England, either for the light of its glass windows, the gleaming of its marble pavements, or the many-coloured paintings which led the eyes to the panelled ceiling above." But to understand the culture that could produce something so magnificent, it helps to go somewhere rather more modest. The Church of St. Bartholomew the Great in London's Smithfield is the capital's oldest parish church. Worshippers have been coming here for 9 centuries, almost as long as the Norman Cathedral at Canterbury has been standing. They come to share in the extraordinary faith which the West inherited via Rome and would make its own. A faith that God himself had become fully human in his Son Jesus, a Jewish carpenter. Executed by crucifixion, Jesus overcame death and opened new hope of heaven to sinful men and women everywhere. This is St. Bartholomew's Lady Chapel, and although it looks a little less ancient than other parts of the building, it too has a long history. At one point it was a printer's workshop, where a young Benjamin Franklin learned his trade. 500 years before that, it was revered because on this spot, a monk called Hubert had a miraculous vision of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Here, she told him, she would receive prayers and vows and grant mercy and blessing forever. Pilgrims of every station have made their way here ever since. Christianity was and remains a faith for everybody. It broke down hierarchies and raised up the low. Its apostles were fishermen and outcasts. They preached that all of us were sinners and all of us could receive God's grace. This faith in moral equality spread across the West, with countless far more modest churches alongside the great cathedrals. Not every shrine could boast a visit from God's mother, nor could the faithful always agree. But they shared a revolutionary moral universe, one that changed the West forever. The magnificent church behind me here in Rome marks St. Paul's burial place. He was martyred in 64 AD after the Great Fire of Rome, when the Emperor Nero started executing Christians wholesale to shift the blame. According to legend, it also once contained another great treasure, the skull of a remarkable woman who walked with Jesus in the Gospels and is also said to have continued his ministry. But Saint Photina, the name means enlightened,
began as a hated outcast.
She was a woman in a world where men were top dogs, but she was also a Samaritan, people who were despised by the Jews of Jesus' time. Worse still, a string of failed relationships with men had cost her all respectability. Even the women of her own tribe wouldn't let Photina come with them to draw water in the cool of the morning. So she went alone, in the heat at midday, which is where Jesus met her. He singled her out, weak, lonely, despised, to announce for the first time that he was the promised Messiah.
I've mentioned the state of women several times. That's a complete contribution of Christianity, the idea that this other person who is different from you and who can provide you with pleasure and offspring, yet has to be taken into account as a full human being. Now, that idea does not spring up in other places. It springs up in that confluence of Christianity and classicism.
Saint Photina, some say, ended up here in Rome in the service of the strange, topsy-turvy Christian god. Her faith is claimed to have converted the daughter of Nero himself. And certainly we know that in Rome, the typical early converts to Christianity were almost all high-born women. Rome was a society built on male power, and unlike the Christians, one comfortable with infanticide. The best families only raised at most a single daughter. Through the bars of this gilded cage, the matrons of Rome heard Judean peasant girls speaking with a confidence and authority they could never have imagined. It must have been an irresistible emancipation.
Photina herself, or so the legend goes, was brought at last before the emperor. Told to renounce her god, she spat in Nero's face, for which, Rome being Rome and Nero being Nero, she was thrown down an empty well and left to starve to death.
Christianity eventually won its battle with the Roman Empire. The Colosseum, where Christians were murdered for entertainment, is now a site of pilgrimage. But at the dawn of the West, the fall of Rome's empire brought in its wake barbarian tribes. These had a heroic and individualistic ethic of their own, but they were often rough, cruel, and uncultured. They presented a whole new challenge to the church. What made the West we know was a fusion of the barbarian warrior spirit with the learning and peaceful moral vision carried by the only institution to have survived Rome's collapse, the church. In time, that created a new intellectual and artistic culture of unparalleled richness. It was a culture that celebrated beauty as a vision of God's perfection, and it produced buildings like this. And not just buildings, but some of the greatest art and music the world has ever known.
One of the least quoted lines in the Gospels is Jesus saying, I say these things to you because I want you to have the joy, I want the joy that's in me to be in you. And you know, you look at a lot of Christians and you think, I'm not seeing the joy there. I think that the joy is actually the northern star of spirituality. I think that that's what you're moving toward. You're moving toward joy. And that joy is a sense that life is just so incredibly worth it, that with all its terror, with all its misery, with all its grief, with all its atrocity, there's something about life that is just inherently good. And that's only beauty produces that feeling in you. The Pietà is almost the embodiment of the concept of beauty. And what is so beautiful about it is that it is so terribly tragic. It is actually a picture of despair, and yet through the beauty that is expressed in the despair and through the love that powers both the death that you're watching and the grief that you're watching, it actually says to you, in the midst of the greatest possible tragedy, which I think for anybody is the loss of a child, in the midst of the greatest possible tragedy, there is something about being a human being that is not just not just meaningful, but joyful and superb. How you do that with a piece of rock, I have no idea, but something flows through a man that is better than himself when he makes a statue like that. You know, the famous vandal who attacked the statue when it was not behind glass, attacked it with a hammer, shouting, "I must destroy what other men cherish," which I think is basically a summation of the people who are trying to destroy the West now, because the Pieta, with its grief, with its beauty, with its love, both maternal and universal, is the central cry of the heart of the West. And I think that it dignifies everything about being a human being without one happy moment in it. And it's just a remarkable, remarkable piece of work.
But if you want a place to stand symbolically for the beginning of the West, it's again much more humble. Here you are. St. Martin's, Canterbury, the oldest church still in use in the English-speaking world. The saint it is dedicated to was a former Roman soldier who became a bishop. St. Martin of Tours was famous for cutting his cloak in half to share with a beggar in the depths of winter, and for sitting on a humble peasant milking stool wherever he went. It is from the legend of his cloak, in Latin capella, that we get our word chaplain. The first chaplains were the men responsible for guarding the holy relic of St. Martin's cloak. Clovis, king of the barbarian Franks, having been converted to Catholic Christianity in 496, used to carry his fragment of the cloak into battle as a talisman.
The Royal Chapel of St. Martin here in Canterbury was built towards the end of the 6th century by this remarkable woman, Queen Bertha of Kent. Bertha was a Frank, Clovis's great-granddaughter. And as in Rome, high-born women like Bertha were often the first to recognise the faith's appeal. Clovis himself had been converted by his wife, Clotilda. And in the year 597, a century after the conversion of Clovis, it happened again. An official mission from the Pope arrived, and Bertha's husband, King Ethelbert, gave up his paganism for the Church of Rome. Ethelbert was baptized into the faith on June the 2nd, the Feast of Pentecost. Perhaps music like this was sung. It was written several decades earlier for a great ceremony in Tours, and it's still in use today. Vexilla regis prodeunt. The royal banner forward goes. From this moment, at least within Ethelbert's domain, the Roman missionaries were free to preach openly and to build more churches. That same year, over 14 centuries ago, saw the founding of Canterbury Cathedral.
By the time of King Ethelbert here, Christianity had been known in Britain for centuries. But it had vanished in the east with the coming of the Saxons. Now it came back, here and elsewhere, as one last Roman import. That gave it status, the voice of a tradition already centuries old, and a connection to the lost greatness of the empire. But it also created a healthy separation between the men of God and the new rulers. The new infusion from Rome brought both fresh energy and encouragement for learning, and it threw out the pagans' old gods. But it did not replace their culture wholesale. As a Christian, Ethelbert would produce the earliest surviving document written in English, which was also our first written law code. It upholds a long, unwritten tradition that was pre-Christian.
60 years later, and 300 miles north, a monastery was founded at Whitby under the formidable abbess Hilda, named after a Valkyrie, but now a leading light of Anglo-Saxon Christianity, sought out by kings for her wisdom. 20 years after that, Whitby was joined by the abbey of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow. Far from Rome, the cultural fusion was beginning to create something truly new, not just an oasis of the remnants of imperial culture. A new intellectual centre was forming. It would produce the Venerable Bede, not only the father of English history, but also a scholar of tremendous and wide-ranging influence. We date our years before and after the birth of Christ, thanks to Bede.
On the continent, the new Christian culture was also pressing its moral revolution. In the mid-7th century, the Frankish king, Clovis II, married the devout Bathilde. Her name means "she who is fierce in battle," and she had been sold into slavery as a girl, possibly from East Anglia. This is said to be her modest chemise. When Clovis died, Bathilde ruled as queen regent for her son. She ended the enslavement of Christians and worked to buy the freedom of others. The Christian West continued to accommodate the ancient tradition of slavery, and it would be revived on a terrible scale centuries later, before being outlawed for good. But 1,000 years earlier, slavery was already an affront to Bathilde's Christian conscience. Her husband, too, showed a respect rarely given to slaves when he dignified their relationship with the sacrament of marriage. In England, under the Anglo-Saxons, slavery continued, but under the Normans, who were hardly gentle rulers, by 1102, a church council ordered, "Let no one dare hereafter to engage in the infamous business, prevalent in England, of selling men like animals."
Meanwhile, in other ways, church and rulers began to come together again, dreaming of a Roman revival. In the 8th century, priests began not just baptizing Frankish kings, but anointing them with oil as well, a sacred tradition we continue in our coronations to this day. The ceremony drew on the biblical tradition of King David, the shepherd boy who slew a giant with a well-aimed slingshot. It gave the recipients an outsized legitimacy. The Frankish king Charlemagne, who benefited from the change, wasn't always obviously Christian in his actions. In the year 782, he slaughtered 4,500 pagan Saxons in a single day. Despite the New Testament's call to love your enemies, the biblical actions of King David justified brutal treatment of prisoners, at least in his mind. And Charlemagne's bloody campaigns united much of Western Europe for the first time since the fall of Rome.
In the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned as a new Roman emperor by the Pope. Charlemagne said afterwards it was a mistake, and for the West, it was a close thing. The period did bring a cultural flowering. Charlemagne called a monk named Alcuin from northeast England to his court, helping to preserve and spread the monastery's emerging intellectual culture. Yet there was also a theocratic and imperial trend under Charlemagne that could have frozen the West in its tracks. Fortunately, Charlemagne's coronation immediately proved more trouble than it was worth, bringing war and dissension rather than cementing a new era of imperial peace. There would be no final return to Rome's empire in the West. But the tension remained between the West's heroic and warlike tendencies and its Christian values of love and peace. Western Christians would bring heroic courage and energy to acts of compassion and lives of devotion, notably through the monastic orders, which became a new civilizing presence across Europe. In return, that Christian spirit demanded that Europe's wars be just and righteous, which was how they saw the Crusades.
The songs of David inspired holy warriors, but the deep concern of the Psalms for victims also went hand in hand with Christian peacemaking. During the Second Crusade, a monk called Radulf stirred up an orgy of Jew murder in the Rhine Valley. Bernard of Clairvaux galloped there on horseback and told the locals, "Anyone who attacks a Jew and tries to kill him, it is as though he attacks Jesus himself." He quoted Psalm 59, "Slay them not, lest my people forget." The High Middle Ages also produced a remarkable domestic culture, spread by troubadours from Provence, and, we believe, popularized at Poitiers by Eleanor of Aquitaine, the mother of Richard the Lionheart. This world of courtly love did its best to civilize the barbarous knights with a world of domestic entertainment, songs and storytelling, in which women were placed in charge and men competed to do them honorable service. This was the other and equally vital side of the Christian Revolution. Not just because women, or at least aristocratic ones, were now being given a voice, but because it placed romantic love and the personal choice of who to love as a preeminent value. Christianity demanded that conversion should be a personal choice, even if its warriors didn't always observe that in practice. And in the same way, it thought that marriage should also be an act of choice, not something imposed by parents. It also set strict rules on who could marry at all, and that would have lasting consequences.
Think about marriage in the Western world. Marriage requires the consent of the bride and the groom. That might seem obvious, but it's not. In most parts of the world, marriages are arranged. Why is the West different? In great part, it's because of the Church. The Church fought against arranged marriages to close kin for a very long time in medieval Europe and beyond. Of course, the European aristocracy was fond of arranged marriages, and often those marriages were to kin. But the Church was a force fighting against that. Now, if you look at most of the rest of the world, you'll find that their societies are kin-based. They are based on certain systematic patterns of marriage. And these societies are built around groups, and the emphasis is not on individual rights. The emphasis is on the honor of a group, which is often upheld by arranging just the right sort of marriage. So the Church actually helped to bring about a social situation which was the predicate for the later revolution in France. So if we add the interest of Christianity in the equality of believers before God, and the interest of Christianity in the free choice, the volition of the bride and the groom going into marriage, what do we have? Equality and liberty, the principles of modern liberal democracy.
In relations with other civilizations, the West is attempting to do something which it cannot do, and which the other civilizations somewhat resent. It is attempting to present itself as a completely post-religious civilization, and its own ideas, essentially liberal ideas, as being something which can be universal values in those societies as well as ours. And I think if you're from either a Confucian cultural background or an Islamic one, or indeed any other civilization, you think that this is a kind of species of fraud. That, you know, do you think, do these Westerners really think we don't know they're Christians? You know, these ideas stem from Christianity.
In the West, Christianity's emphasis on choice in love was an emblem of its concern for individual dignity in general, something that also made sense to the culture's barbarian side. There is no greater early expression of the new unity that emerged between barbarian warrior and thoughtful Christian who cared for his people's intellectual and spiritual development than Alfred the Great. In the 9th century, the West's hard-won new culture was under threat again from Danish attacks. Alfred not only succeeded in battle, but he also worked to preserve the Christian culture of learning. This time, in his own language. He translated St. Gregory's Pastoral Care from Latin into English, and in his preface he wrote, "If we have peace, all the youth of free men of England, those that have the opportunity to give themselves to it, should be bound to learning until they all know how to read English writing."
A biblical education is necessary if you're going to appreciate much of the products that grew out of the Western tradition. And the more that people are unmoored from the Bible, whether they believe in it or not is a different matter, and that's equally important potentially, but the more that they're unmoored from that, the more they're a stranger in their own culture, because Christianity, whether we are confessional believers or not, has gone a long way to making the moral imagination, the moral the moral imagination and the cultural universe of the West.
Christianity has forged us. It's formed not only who we are as individuals in ways that we don't even recognize, in our moral instincts, in our national character, but it's formed the very fabric of the country that we live in. In some ways, the actual geography of the country, where our biggest cities are, and where the cultural centres have been throughout our history. So I think Christianity has shaped us in ways that we fail to even recognise, because, as with freedom, it's something that we have always had and therefore completely take for granted, and then are discarding at our peril.
This was the emerging Christian culture of the West, a living, evolving tradition, warlike, yes, but also intellectual, joyful and creative, celebrating the individual's need to turn to God and to choose who to love. An advocate, often imperfect, for the poor, for slaves and for women. An institution that believed in forgiveness and a God of unfailing love. Its values were the foundation for today's Western societies, where slavery is illegal, Christian worship is a choice we must each make for ourselves, and women serve as heads of state, presidents and prime ministers, even in some churches, as bishops. Christian belief, then as now, called to men and to women, but it required humility to forgive your enemies, offer charity, and accept the impossible. To know that you were a sinner, like all of us, without losing hope, and to have faith it was not a sign of weakness, to kneel before a just and loving God, and accept his mercy.